Welcome to the Tempo Storm Wild Meta Snapshot Breakdown. With the conclusion of the 2019 Wild Open, the ladder continues to change almost weekly. Despite the new expansion being released relatively soon, the meta continues to evolve. Warlock continues to be a really powerful class, but many other decks are stepping up to contest its spot atop the ladder. Aggressive decks are doing their part in shutting down the Warlock as they try to become the best deck in Wild. Decks continue to move around within tiers as they adapt to the current meta. Before we jump in, make sure you're subscribed to the channel in order to keep up to date with our Hearthstone content. Without further ado, let's take a look at the first tier. Kingsbane Rogue has successfully dethroned Even Warlock and taken the top spot of the tier list. While the deck only went up a single spot, it's impressive to note how little time it took for this deck to become the best Wild deck. In early January, the deck didn't exist in its current form, and in only a few months it has risen to the top. This goes to show how many meta changes can occur simply from more players coming over to play the format. Kingsbane Rogue does really well against slower combo decks such as Cube Warlock or Mind Blast Priest. This is because of the constant pressure the Kingsbane Rogue can apply, making it too difficult for the combo decks to safely assemble their game plan. Kingsbane Rogue struggles to deal with other aggressive decks as it doesn't have many ways to interact with large boards. Until the new expansion, it's likely Kingsbane Rogue will remain on top. Next up on the tier list is Even Warlock. Although it fell from its top spot in the last snapshot, Even Warlock is still an incredibly versatile deck. Even Warlock has too many tools in its arsenal and can abuse the one-mana hero power quite easily. Even Warlock can change its game plan easily depending on the matchup, giving it game against any deck. Even Warlock's best matchups are against decks like Odd Paladin or Mech Hunter. These decks succumb to both the removal spells and taunts that Warlock has in its arsenal. Decks that can easily deal with the Warlock's threats tend to be bad matchups for Even Warlock. For example, Mind Blast Priest has a really easy time removing their minions and can then close out the game with burst combos, rendering the Warlock useless. Odd Paladin climbs the ladder this week and rises to Tier 1. Odd Paladin's rise to power can be credited to the Kingsbane Rogue and Tempo Mage becoming decks that are seen more significantly on the ladder. Odd Paladin also has the benefit of being more straightforward, leaving less room for punishing misplays. As previously mentioned, Odd Paladin preys on Kingsbane Rogue and Tempo Mage, both of which have been seeing more play lately. Odd Paladin can just out-pressure both of these decks, and the repeated spam of tokens can be hard for both to deal with. As it always has, Odd Paladin struggles to deal with consistent board clears that can be backed up by threats. Decks such as Even and Cube Warlock can comfortably remove the Paladin's board a few times until it can summon its own threats to close out the game. Next up is Cube Warlock. This is the second Warlock deck in Tier 1, which is a good showing of how powerful Warlock cards and their hero power can be. Similarly to Big Priest, Cube Warlock can cheat out minions ahead of curve, and thus forcing their opponent to deal with it. Unlike in Standard, Cube Warlock has tools to tutor these minions out. This makes the deck have its explosive turns more frequently and can be very oppressive for decks without easy answers to these minions. Cube Warlock takes advantage of decks that can't deal with the repeated large minions, such as any Finn Paladin. Most of the time, if the Paladin lacks an explosive start, the Warlock will be free to run off with the game. While Cube Warlock does have access to a lot of removal, hyper-aggressive decks such as Tempo Mage can be problematic due to the early pressure coupled alongside the burn spells. If the Warlock doesn't draw both their removal and healing, the game will likely play itself out. Finally, rounding off Tier 1, we have Even Shaman. Despite the previous nerfs to Flametongue Totem, the deck remains a dominating force in the meta, mostly due to its good matchup against Kingsbane Rogue. Even Shaman is a deck that can often find wins even when severely behind, making it a good choice for ladder. As mentioned before, Even Shaman feeds on the Kingsbane Rogue players as the Rogue simply cannot deal with the pressure the Shaman applies. On top of this, Shaman players frequently run at least one copy of Galaka Crawler, which can provide a huge tempo swing when played. With the loss of Flametongue Totem, Even Shaman has issues playing against decks that can apply a lot of minion pressure early, as it has less ways to trade easily. For example, Odd Paladin is now one of the deck's worst matchups due to the Shaman's inability to capitalize on its board leads. Priest is the winner with this snapshot, as it's the only class to have a new deck being featured on the tier list. Mind Blast Priest has been a deck in Standard for a while, but with access to all of the available cards Hearthstone has to offer, its power level is significantly higher. Despite this being the deck's first time on the Wild Meta Snapshot, it finds itself at the forefront of Tier 2. Mind Blast Priest has a lot of tools in its arsenal, such as burst and removal, making it problematic for slower decks to beat. Even Warlock happens to be one of the Priest's best matchups, as the Priest is free to apply pressure early and can close out the game with its burst. Mind Blast Priest struggles to beat Kingsbane Rogue and Odd Paladin, as the decks can put on a lot of pressure and have the tools needed to close out the game before the Priest can. Once again, Tier 2 is fairly wide due to the sheer number of competitively viable decks in Wild. A lot of the decks in the second tier are of similar strength, but their positions on the list are due to the current meta. Let's take a look at a few of the top decks in this tier. Following the new Mind Blast Priest is another Priest archetype. Big Priest is a deck that many players hate to hear the name of. The sole play sound of Barns will give some players nightmares. Luckily for these players, Big Priest isn't as meta-defining as it once was. Its spot in Tier 2 can be attributed to how bad of a matchup it has against Kingsbane Rogue, which is currently the best deck. Big Priest has a lot of good matchups and can find a win in a lot of bad spots simply by drawing Barns. The last deck we'll take a look at today is Mechathan Warlock. This is another combo deck that shows off truly how good the Warlock class is. This archetype was another product of the influx of players during the 2019 Wild Open qualification period. While Mechathan Warlock struggles to compete against some of the faster decks such as Tempo Mage or Kingsbane Rogue, it has insanely favorable matchups against slow, grindy decks like Odd Warrior. These matchups typically come down to combo disruption high-rolling the right targets. If you're looking to gain an edge and counter the top decks of the meta, look no further than Tempo Mage. This deck is making a splash on its return to the meta, and it's a good pickup to deal with the pesky Kingsbane Rogue and even Warlocks that are crowding up the ladder. Tempo Mage surprisingly has a lot of good matchups against the top decks and will possibly see itself being listed higher on the tier list in the future, depending on how the lists develop. With Ice Block being added to recent lists, decks can struggle to kill off the Mage before they piece together all their burn to close out the game. Tempo Mage is a strong deck and when piloted well, can be a good counter to the current meta. Overall, the Wild meta is in a better state than ever, and it's set to only get better with the start of the Year of the Dragon. This Wild meta is shifting around frequently, and changes are consistently happening, making the game feel more fresh and fun to play in. Thank you for watching our Snapshot Breakdown. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with our other Hearthstone content. Have a great week. Until next time.